Hi, Jim Nichols here, and as long as we're socially isolated from one another, I thought I'd try my hand at producing a video class. And this is a first try for me, first time experience perhaps for you, but we'll try to continue. We're going to be on lesson number 18 from our lessons on the parable of Jesus. And it's found beginning at page 96 of the book Sandaled Story.
The title of the lesson is Hi, Neighbor. Our text is Luke 10, 25 through 37. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied, how do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the one who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. A good educator knows the importance of keeping the lines open with the student. And that's why, at least in educator circles, the only stupid question is the question that goes unasked. Every question asked by a student should be treated with respect and answered as directly and helpfully as possible. This is difficult for teachers to keep in mind, chiefly because, well, to be honest, there are stupid questions. I've had to deal with them from time to time, and they come from people who haven't paid attention. My wife's a teacher. She's had to deal with them. Well, just ask her. Ask any teacher. You know, my wife knows I ask her stupid questions regularly. The question the expert in law asked was a stupid question. He wasn't seeking a valid answer to a problem he had. He was seeking to justify himself. Yet the master teacher didn't rebuke him by saying, well, that's a stupid question. Instead, Jesus told his most captivating story. Now, a poll has been taken of all the parables Jesus told, and the most popular, most familiar of them is the one that we're covering here, the Good Samaritan. It's repeated freely even among non-Christians. It's cited in law and literature. It has changed the way people use the term and think of the term Samaritan as well. But the story opens with an indescript term, a certain man. He was average, no name given, no occupation known. He could be anyone. He could be you or me on any given day, going about our business while disaster lurks around the corner. He was Jewish. We know this because of the way the rest of the story unfolds. The behavior of his kinsman appalls us as much as the behavior of the Samaritan surprises us. He was unsuspecting of his role in this drama. This man was not the neighbor the expert in law asked about. Yet, in a very real sense, he was about to become a neighbor by the one who neighbored him. He is the victim, the one needing compassion. His trip along the Jericho road was well known to every pilgrim who went to Jerusalem for the feast. It was a winding, mountainous road, uphill, almost all the way from Jericho to Jerusalem, all downhill for the route he took. And because terrain was so uneven, it was desolate in many spots. Thieves could and did ambush lone travelers along this route, just as they waylaid this man in the story. And the next characters in our drama are indeed when our certain man fell among thieves. The philosophy of these guys was, what's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. It's a lowly code to live by, but we expect no better from such a group. In some ways, we could limit our compassion to the man who was victimized by them. Excuse me. Most people traveled the Jericho road in groups. Thieves hung out along that route. Go into the wrong part of town at the wrong time of day, and what else could you expect? These kind of people populate the earth, so we avoid them. And we know little about these thieves either. If we go by stereotypes, we could imagine them to be Samaritans as well as thieves. Because at this point, I expect that's exactly what the average person in Jesus' audience was doing with the story. Samaritans hated Jews, and Jews hated Samaritans. Don't think racial profiling is a phenomenon unique to the 21st century. Then we're exposed to the more highly esteemed characters of the drama. A priest came by, and so too a Levite. The next two characters interjected in the story live by the philosophy, what's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it. They are not, in popular thought, unethical men. They represent the vast majority of people in our own society. People afraid to hazard their own safety for the sake of a stranger in need. In Queens, New York, March 13th, 1964, the newspapers carried the incredible story of the attack and murder of 38-year-old Kitty Genovese. Kitty had parked her little car down the street and was walking to her apartment just a little after midnight when an attacker stabbed her. She screamed for help, and when she screamed, several windows went up. "Leave her alone," one man called. Her attacker ran away. Wounded, Kitty staggered and asked somebody, anybody, for help. But no help came. Instead, her attacker came back and stabbed a few times more. Kitty Genovese screamed, "Oh my God, he stabbed me! Please help me! I'm dying! I'm dying!" Several other windows came up. Once again, her attacker fled. Once again, nobody came to her assistance. A bus full of people went by without stopping. Kitty was crawling and sobbing. Her attacker resumed a third time. Kitty Genovese screamed for help again, this time more weakly. And finally, someone called the police, who arrived in just 2 minutes. Too late to save Kitty Genovese's life. Her body was in the doorway about half a block from where she'd first screamed. Total time elapsed was 30 minutes. A subsequent investigation revealed that no less than 38 people had witnessed this crime. Probably a few more who were never interviewed or never admitted what they had seen and failed to do were also involved as witnesses. But when asked why they didn't help her, almost all of them said they were afraid to get involved and they assumed someone else would help. You wonder how a priest and Levite could pass by on the other side of this wounded man? This is what the majority of people do. You see, the priest and Levite weren't just average people. They were above average. They were religious people. And all we would expect to show mercy, we would expect it to be the religious people, wouldn't we? But you see, touching a corpse can make you ceremonially unclean, and perish the thought that you couldn't do at the temple what you were supposed to do because you'd done something like that along the Jericho road for what you were supposed to do. The thieves could be lurking nearby, using that bleeding man for bait for more victims. And what about the biohazard in all that blood from a stranger, huh? The time would take, the expense it would involve. All of it adds to difficulty and a host of reasons to let someone else come by besides them. So the story now turns on the introduction of the main character, a Samaritan, who took pity on him. The Samaritan lived by the code which says, "What's mine is yours, if you need it." When first told this story, he selected the Samaritan as the one who was the neighbor because Samaritans are hated. It was a common custom of the time for a Jewish person to spit before and after saying the word Samaritan so he wouldn't defile his mouth. And even though it meant crossing the Jordan River twice, the customary route for Galilean Jews to go to Jerusalem for the feasts was to go through Perea around Samaria, way around Samaria, and not without good reason. Samaritans hated Jews just as much as Jews hated Samaritans. It was a Samaritan village that refused to allow Jesus seek lodging in it because he was on his way to Passover in Jerusalem. Some of you might remember that this was the time James and John asked the Lord if he should call down fire from heaven on that place. John, later the disciple of love, and here he was seeking permission to nuke an entire village. But back to our story. Ethnic differences were forgotten in the pathos of this scene. A man was bleeding, dying without help. First aid was provided. His own beast of burden was used to bring the wounded man to the inn. Apparently, all his resources were in those 2 silver coins he gave the innkeeper after a long night of caring for the sick man, because he took out a line of credit to see that he was properly cared for until he was well. I've seen generosity which gives out of a surplus. A vast majority of people do this. When Katrina flattened and flooded the Gulf Coast, billions were donated. But how many people do you know who took out loans so they could help the needy from that disaster, or, for that matter, for any disaster you care to name? There's a reason we call this man the Good Samaritan. What was his other name? We don't know. What was his was the other man's, because he needed it. One night, several years ago, a traveling couple named Fred and Marlene Nichols, no relationship, had stopped at a service station when they were suddenly struck by a trucker who had lost control of his vehicle. They were both injured badly. As Fred lay there bleeding, unable to move, he felt a stranger's hand on his shoulder, and when he looked up, he couldn't believe his eyes. It was Bobby Knight. Bobby Knight, then basketball coach for the Indiana Hoosiers, and everybody knew his reputation for being a tantrum-throwing hothead. Earlier that year, his team had won the NCAA championship, and Knight was on his way to receive the Coach of the Year award when he came upon the scene of the accident. Nichols said Knight took charge of the situation, offered words of comfort and hope, and even stayed with their belongings until the wreckers arrived. Now, this story never made the headlines, was barely mentioned by the media, but it shows us that the wild man on the basketball court isn't all there is to Bobby Knight. He might be something of a despised Samaritan, especially if the Nicholses were Purdue fans. But we get back to this question. A stupid question indeed. Jesus never indicted the expert in law for his stupid question. But he did show how irrelevant it was by the question he asked at the end. Who was neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? You see, Jesus still hadn't answered the question, who is my neighbor? Instead, he showed us the real question that needed to be asked. To whom can I be a neighbor? Roger Olean was an ordinary guy, a sheet metal foreman at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. He was stopped in rush hour traffic, heard that a plane had hit the bridge and crashed into the icy Potomac. He got out of his car, ran to the bridge, and saw survivors popping amidst the ice in the water. So he jumped in. Lenny Skutnik sounds like someone you'd never remember, just an average 28-year-old office worker earning $16,000 a year in Washington, D.C. And like everyone else, he wanted to get home and was disappointed on that snowy January 13th in 1982 to find traffic stalled there on the 14th Street Bridge. People were out of their cars, staring over the rail. Lenny got out and looked too. And he saw 6 struggling survivors of Air Florida Flight 90 holding on to the tail section of the plane in the middle of the icy waters. Lots of people were on the bridge. Ordinary people, good people. Lenny looked at the people in the water, though, and he couldn't stay on the bridge. Lenny kicked off his shoes, took off his overcoat, and jumped into the ice floe. Gene Windsor and Don Usher had taken off in a 2-person helicopter from nearby Anacostia Park. Ambulances were still a long way off in rush hour traffic. The helicopter couldn't take on passengers, just lower a float ball on the rope. One survivor in the water helped a woman secure the rope to herself, and they managed to get her out of the water to the shore. But too little time remained for the other 5. Others on the shore saw Roger Olean in the water and Lenny Skutnik's high dive into the water, and they determined that they could make a chain of rescue by wading out as far as the depth would allow them to do. They used jumper cables and towels to make as long a rescue line as they could. Don Usher was back for the second survivor's rescue. The same man who'd helped the woman with the rope before helped this person too. The chopper literally dragged this person across the top of the water to the waders near the shore. The 50-year-old crash survivor at the wreckage helped survivor number 3 into the rope, and she made it part way but was too cold and stiff to hold on. The chopper had to lower the rope again so she could grab hold and again be drugged to the waiting rescuers on the shore. Survivor number 4 was helped into the rope, was pulled to safety. But in the meantime, the tail section went below the water. The 5th survivor was rescued by Lenny Skutnik, the high diver, whose willingness to get involved had motivated so many others. He'd made it to her and was able to help her get secured by the rope so they both could be drugged to the shore. The only person who remained out of the 6 that emerged from that wreck was the 50-year-old man who kept helping everybody else into the rope. When bodies were recovered, a coroner's autopsy revealed that Arland Williams, Jr. had to be that man. His was the only body recovered that died by drowning. Everyone else had died by the impact of the crash. Gene Windsor, the paramedic who was in the helicopter, sobbed. He could have saved himself, but he kept giving the rope to everyone else. And if today you cross the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C., you will find people now refer to it as the Arland Williams Bridge. A lot of good Samaritans emerged that day, many of whom sprang into action when Roger Olean and Lenny Skutnik dove into the frigid waters of the Potomac. Several people said they didn't have to do that, but not Lenny Skutnik. He said, "I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." Look around you. There are wounded men on every route you travel. They sit in class with the students. They check out your groceries at the market. They stand with you on the elevator. They eat lunch in the break room with you. They're in the club. They're at the mall. They're in the shop. They're in the waiting room. They're on television. They're even at your doorstep.
Would you dare to get involved? Neighborliness is determined by us, not the other guy. Whether anyone else helps or not is between him, his Lord, and his conscience. But if you and I don't pitch in, who will? There are things that you and I could do, especially right now when we're facing a crisis. I welcome you to think about what's around, who needs help, and how you can be a neighbor.